After years of third-party offerings and Microsoft's Elite controllers, Sony finally has an OEM Pro-style controller they've brought to market, and it's called the DualSense Edge for PlayStation 5. This is positioned as a customizable premium controller that will allow you to mold a controller's button layout and sensitivity to your liking, with multiple custom presets, and even hardware flexibility with different back buttons, stick caps, and replaceable stick assemblies. Inside the box, you'll find the white hardshell plastic case that the controller comes with. It has an embossed PlayStation logo, and toward the top you'll find a Velcro opening that can be used to charge the controller while it's stored inside the case. Everything you get is inside. The DualSense Edge comes with a 2.8 meter long braided USB-C cable, which is thankfully a good amount longer than the standard USB-C cable your PS5 comes with, which is 1.5 meters long for comparison. You will want to make sure you hang on to the supplied cable though. Looking at the rest of what's included, there is also a locking mechanism for the cable when connected to the controller, and this is something where the chamber is specifically made for this cable, so if you're keen on using this, third-party cables might not fit properly in here. Moving on, you also get 2 lever-style back buttons, 2 half-dome back buttons, 2 high-dome stick caps, and 2 low-dome stick caps. As for the DualSense Edge itself, it looks similar to a standard DualSense in form factor, but there's also some very obvious design changes that make this controller stand out, notably the black D-pad and face buttons, redesigned accenting light bar and touchpad, and the bottom trim piece is now a glossy black plastic. The inner grips are now rubberized and feel quite nice, and they're still textured with thousands of tiny PlayStation buttons, which is now also present more noticeably on the touchpad. On the back is where you'll see the new buttons and switches needed for customizing your play, which right away for those curious, if you say don't want to use back buttons, then you can still hold this in a rested normal position and not feel any of the changes on the back. There's nothing stopping you from using this like a regular DualSense and having any of the new buttons or switches getting in the way of how you would normally hold the controller, outside of the rubber grips, which you are definitely going to feel. And whether you are using the new attachments or not, I would say it was the right move keeping the form factor here the same. We're on year 3 of PS5, and I have no problem saying the DualSense is hands down the best PlayStation controller this company has released so far. And it should absolutely be in the same conversation as one of the best ever all around. So having said that, the DualSense Edge is off to a pretty good start. Getting into the hardware swaps, they're easy enough. If you want to change out a stick cap, just pull it out with gentle force and it pops off. And when placing on a new one, you do have to be a bit mindful of lining it up. They will not pop on from any position, so the easiest way is to rest the stick cap on there and rotate it until it slides down a bit more. And when that happens, that's when you can apply some force and it'll click in. Now, if there's a time where an analog stick is broken or you're experiencing stick drift, one handy feature of the Edge is being able to swap out the entire assembly. You can buy an OEM stick module from Sony. They come in this very tiny box, and as of January 2022, these will run you about $19.99 USD for one of them. But to replace these, you'll have to hit this very tiny release switch on the back that will get the front trim piece off without any sort of careful prying that you would have to do on a standard DualSense. You'll then see the silver lever flanking each module. Lift this up, and you'll see the stick assembly inch a bit out of its position. Just pull it out, place a new one in, pull the lever down all the way to where you can visibly see the module retract in, and you're good to go. Just make sure the 2 hooks on the black trim piece are placed in first from a downward angle, and then level it out to make a solid connection back to the controller. It's a very simple swap, and something that may prove invaluable for long-term ownership. The back buttons are also easy enough to use. They connect and hold with magnets, and it's a solid connection. I can't picture any normal scenarios where these would somehow fall out by accident. If anything, it's more of a pain just figuring out the right angle and sweet spot for how they go in, but you'll pick up on that in a short while. As for the trigger stops, these are adjustments you can make for how far you need to press L2 and R2 before an input is accepted, and these can be adjusted independently of one another. The top setting is for a full throw, what you'd normally expect on any controller. The second setting comes down about halfway, so think of a game that uses adaptive triggers that has some sort of gameplay feature halfway down. That's about where this goes. And then the bottom setting is for the shortest throw, barely pressing the trigger stops it very quickly, ideal for shooting games. Lastly, on the bottom of the Edge, you'll see the new function buttons. These are what you're going to use to activate software shortcuts on PlayStation 5, which let's move on to that now. When you first connect a DualSense Edge, Sony has a setup wizard in place that gives you a tour of the new controller, and this is where you'll see all the software side customizations you can make, for which there is a lot. There is a surprisingly robust menu with a wide range of settings to play with and adjust. First, there's your custom profiles. You can have 4 total, 1 is default, the other 3 are custom, and from there you can alter button assignments, stick sensitivity and dead zones, trigger dead zones, and the vibration or trigger intensity. Button assignments, as you'd expect, let you rearrange how you want these, but you can now also map anything to the back buttons except stick inputs and the share button. Those are the only things you cannot map to the back buttons, but you could do options or even the touchpad. Stick sensitivity is where you can alter the input behavior in a pretty substantial way, as there's a number of different curve settings you can play around with here, and I do like that Sony has provided a brief description of each one that might give you a better idea of when and where you'd want to use each one of these. From there, you can then adjust the curve further and even see a real-time look at what the curve looks like versus your physical movements on the controller. There's also a dead zone adjustment setting as well, which, if I'm being honest, it would have been nice seeing what is a pure software setting unlocked for all DualSense controllers. It's completely understandable that the Edge is going to have its advantages, and at this point it certainly does, but it probably would be better served to throw this into standard UI settings for any owner that might need this in the event they have a drifting DualSense that cannot easily see a stick replacement. Trigger dead zones is similar in that you can get a real-time view of this and how it can be altered. This does also account for the physical settings on the Edge as well, where if you set your range too low in relation to your shortest throw, you do get a warning message that the trigger may not input correctly. Anyway, you can name these profiles and assign them to shortcuts that require the function button. This is where you can swap between profiles on the fly by holding either function button and the associated face button you've assigned the profile to. Holding function by itself will bring up a small menu that displays your current shortcuts. There's also ones that take you directly to the customization menu, or using the D-pad to adjust audio levels for a connected headset, which is extremely useful. Another nice touch is that there is a setting which lets you hide most of these UI pop-ups. You'll always get notifications in the top right when switching profiles, but you can minimize or even remove the function window completely. You can also alter the feedback received when switching profiles. There's a slight haptic vibration that can be turned off, and light bar indicators that you might not even realize are there when switching profiles, but these too can be turned off. Something else that was really nice to see is that if you're, say, switching PSN accounts on the same console, but you're still using the same controller, changing the controller profiles will eventually bring up a prompt asking you how you want the settings stored. You can choose the one stored on the console or the one stored on the controller, and you can also double check the differences the console has identified as a conflict, and that was a nice touch. Now, it is worth pointing out one really odd drawback that's a huge bummer. The shortcut for adjusting headphone volume or your game chat balance is only for headphones connected to the 3.5mm headphone jack. This will not work with Sony's Pulse 3D wireless headset or most other wireless headsets. So let's talk about using the DualSense Edge for gaming. Now, like I said earlier, this thing is off to a good start just purely off of the form factor alone. It was a smart play keeping it the same, but when it comes to all the customizations, they can certainly feel additive in a good way. I'm a big fan of how whatever you don't need, it doesn't have to be used and become intrusive. Having said that, this is the kind of controller where you have to figure out how you want to make the best use of it. Experimentation is key, and I'm sure you'll find something that will eventually work best for whatever you want to get done. I have noticed a lot of people that have never owned a controller like this are showing interest in this one, and so my advice is don't go into this thinking you have to set up the perfect profile right away. Just start playing your games. You'll soon get a feel for what you want to map and what you'd want to adjust while you're in the moment. The number one thing you'll want to try though is mapping something to the back buttons that helps keep your thumbs on the sticks while you're aiming. In Returnal, that's assigning my jump and dash to the back buttons. You might find it hard at first to relearn a game you're already used to, but it does keep you aiming and shooting in chaotic moments where it's needed most. I spent a good portion of my testing on this game, as it's one of my favorites, and so for this setup, I have one standard stick cap on the left and high dome on the right. I'm using the lever back buttons, and I have my right trigger set to the shortest throw. My stick profiles are also set to the quick setting, which is best suited for fast-paced shooters. It didn't take long at all for me to really enjoy this setup, and it's one where I'd be happy to carry this over to similar genres, which I also tried for Call of Duty, which I then tweaked here and there for more experimentation. Admittedly, I'm not much of a PvP guy, so that's where it's really important to go over who this controller is for. Generally speaking, in this price range, you might want this for improving your reaction time during competitive play, and I have no doubt this controller will work towards that goal, but this can absolutely be used for really whatever you want. That's the beauty of it. I messed around with a few different games and found a variety of different use cases, and even when I didn't find any value in messing around with, say, the settings or the triggers, I still found it cool to use the low dome stick caps, which essentially turn the Edge into a controller that's reminiscent of DualShocks 1 through 3. As for the different back buttons, I did not care for the dome versions. These keep your fingers in a slightly higher position, not nearly as rusted as the levers, so for my playstyle preference, I did not care for these, but I could see how they might make sense for others. I think Sony has done a lot here that makes this controller a serious consideration if you value the sort of in-depth customization on offer here, especially with the potential of swapping out the stick assembly, and with the stick caps and stick modules, this could also open up an aftermarket for more variety and possibly Hall effect sensors, and it's the ease of use and accessibility of it that makes this such an attractive option. However, a big drawback is battery life. The consequence of squeezing in new features into the same form factor has resulted in a smaller battery capacity, a 1050 mAh battery versus the standard DualSense, which has a 1560 mAh battery. This translates to a battery life in the neighborhood of 4 hours on the low end to 6 on the high end. Not great, because if you do enjoy long play sessions, you're going to hit that wall of having to charge or plug in, which, depending on the buyer, it's a non-issue. Again, these controllers are geared towards a competitive audience that's going to prefer a hardwired connection, so if that's you, this isn't really an issue. But if you're someone who's always wanted to try one of these pricier pro-style controllers, and this would be your first one, you might find disappointment in losing a bit of convenience that you're afforded with these standard controllers and their battery life. Should be worth mentioning though, the Edge has no problem docking comfortably on Sony's official charging stand. It looks quite nice on there. The other main issue is, if you're coming from other Pro controllers, then you're only getting 2 back buttons here. That alone can be a deal breaker, especially if you're already used to a setup on a different controller that does use more than 2. That setup is simply not going to work on the Edge, so you'd have to compromise on your preferred control style, and I'm not entirely sure if there's enough software features here that would make up ground on losing 2 buttons. It's a shame really, because with 4 buttons this would make the Edge an undeniably excellent choice in its market category. So for what the DualSense Edge is, I like it a lot. It turned out better than I was expecting, and that's thanks to all these software features that are surprisingly deep and easy to use, which is something that could see some tweaks and improvements over time with firmware updates, and possibly get even better. I do find that the Edge is in a bit of an awkward spot though. It isn't bad, I'd say far from it, but for casual consumers that might be thinking about their first Pro controller, you're gonna lose some battery life. And for the competitive player looking to improve their game, you're only getting 2 back buttons, making the DualSense Edge a controller that I would recommend as long as you're okay with taking a few steps back in some important areas. Thank you so much for watching this review. Hopefully you found this useful, and if you haven't just yet, please consider subscribing for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates that are here on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter @MysticRyan, and that is it. I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.